The closing weeks of November 1852 marked a pivotal moment in the annals of global history, a period when the currents of industrial progress began to wash against the shores of a nation deliberately frozen in time. From the bustling naval yards of Norfolk, Virginia, a formidable squadron of 10 United States warships slipped its moorings and set a course for the distant, enigmatic empire of Japan. This was not a mere diplomatic voyage, it was an expression of a new nation's burgeoning power and its unyielding ambition to project that power across the vast expanse of the Pacific. At the helm of this monumental undertaking was Commodore Matthew Perry, a figure whose reputation was as solid and unyielding as the steam-powered vessels he commanded. Known throughout the American naval service as the "father of the steam navy," Perry was the living embodiment of the technological revolution that was rapidly transforming maritime warfare and global commerce. His selection for this mission was no accident, it was a clear signal that the United States was prepared to deploy its most advanced capabilities to achieve its objectives. The aims of the Perry expedition were twofold, a duality of commercial ambition and strategic foresight that reflected America's growing presence on the world stage. The primary goal was to compel the isolationist government of Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate, to abandon its centuries-old policy of "sakoku," closed country, and enter into trade relations with the United States. American whalers and merchants plying the lucrative routes to China desperately needed access to Japanese ports for provisions, water, and a safe harbor for shipwrecked sailors. The second, equally crucial objective, was strategic. As the age of sail gave way to the age of steam, the need for reliable coaling stations became paramount. The United States envisioned a network of naval bases stretching across the Pacific to support its fleet on the long and arduous journey to the markets of China. Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands under its suzerainty, were perfectly positioned to serve as a vital link in this strategic chain. The mission was, therefore, a complex interplay of economic desire and military calculus, designed to unlock one of the world's last sealed nations for American benefit. News of the impending American arrival was not entirely a surprise to the Japanese authorities. The Dutch, who through a small, highly restricted trading post at Dejima where the only Westerners permitted contact with Japan, had maintained ancient ties. Possessing intelligence of American intentions, they dutifully relayed a warning to the shogunate in Edo. However, the ruling elite of the Tokugawa regime, entrenched in over 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation, viewed this information not as a credible threat but as a foreign provocation. Steeped in a worldview that placed Japan at its center and regarded outsiders with profound suspicion, they failed to grasp the scale of the technological and political forces gathering on the horizon. The warning was dismissed, and no significant measures were taken to prepare the nation's defenses or its diplomatic strategy for the encounter that was to come. This fateful miscalculation would leave Japan profoundly vulnerable to the shock of Perry's arrival. When the American squadron finally appeared off the coast, it was unlike anything the Japanese people had ever witnessed. Their maritime experience was limited to traditional wooden sailing vessels, graceful but technologically primitive. What they saw now were behemoths of a different order. Propelled not by the familiar grace of wind and sail but by the raw, unseen power of steam, the American frigates moved with an inexorable and unsettling purpose. From their tall funnels, they belched thick columns of black smoke, staining the sky and creating an image of terrifying, almost demonic, power. It was this sight that gave birth to the name by which the expedition would forever be remembered in Japanese history, the Kurofune-, or Black Ships. This term, born of shock and fear, transcended its literal meaning to become a powerful symbol, a dark harbinger of the end of Japan's long seclusion and the dawn of an uncertain and tumultuous new era. The visual and auditory impact of the Black Ships on the coastal communities was profound and visceral, a sensory assault that shattered the tranquility of feudal Japan. On the waves of a sea that had once been the domain of fishermen and coastal traders, an entirely new reality materialized. As described in contemporary accounts, these were not merely ships, they were perceived as enormous black monsters, alien leviathans emerging from the deep. The dark, coal-fired smoke that poured from their stacks gave them the appearance of living, breathing creatures, while the loud, piercing shrieks of their steam whistles echoed across the water, a sound so unfamiliar and powerful that it seemed to shake the very soul of all living things along the Japanese shore. This was not a diplomatic overture in the traditional sense, it was a demonstration of a power so overwhelming and technologically advanced that it bordered on the supernatural, heralding a confrontation that would irrevocably alter the destiny of a nation. To understand the man who would force open the gates of Japan, one must look to a life forged in the crucible of military service and national expansion. The figure who would become a symbol of Western power in Japan was not a diplomat by trade but a seasoned warrior, whose career was a microcosm of America's own assertive growth in the 19th century. Matthew Perry was born on April 10, 1794, in the maritime state of Rhode Island, into a family where service to the nation was not just a career but a legacy. He was steeped in a martial tradition from birth. His older brother, Oliver Hazard Perry, was already a celebrated naval officer, destined for fame as the hero of the Battle of Lake Erie. Adding a touch of historical romance to his lineage, his mother was a direct descendant of William Wallace, the legendary national hero of Scotland, embedding a narrative of fierce independence and defiance into the family's very identity. This background instilled in Perry a profound sense of duty, discipline, and an unshakable belief in the destiny of the United States. Perry's naval career began in the shadow of his famous brother, but he quickly carved out his own path through decades of active and often perilous service. His baptism by fire came during the War of 1812 against Great Britain, a conflict that solidified American sovereignty and tested the mettle of its young navy. Following the war, in 1815, he served in the Mediterranean during the Second Barbary War, a campaign that saw the United States project its power across the Atlantic to crush the pirates of Algiers and assert the principle of free trade on the high seas. These early experiences exposed him to the realities of naval combat and the complex interplay of military force and international diplomacy. In 1822, Perry demonstrated a flair for bold, unilateral action that would become a hallmark of his career. Sailing to the strategically vital island of Key West, he planted the American flag, decisively claiming the territory for the United States and renaming it Thompson's Island. This act was a clear display of the expansionist fervor that characterized the era and Perry's own role as an agent of that expansion. His reputation as a formidable commander was cemented during the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. Here, Perry was no distant admiral issuing orders from a flagship, he was a hands-on combat leader. He commanded major naval operations, and in a remarkable display of amphibious warfare, he personally led a force of 1,000 soldiers ashore to successfully capture the strategic city of Tabasco. This experience proved his capability not only in ship-to-ship combat but also in organizing and executing complex land assaults, a skill set that would be implicitly understood by the Japanese when his squadron later anchored in Edo Bay. His leadership style, however, was far from gentle. Known for his severe demeanor, strict discipline, and an often gruff, unwelcoming personality, he earned the moniker Old Bruin from the men who served under him. This reputation for austerity and occasional coarseness was a reflection of a man who prioritized results over pleasantries and who commanded respect, if not always affection. By 1840, Perry had risen to the rank of Commodore, the highest position attainable in the United States Navy at that time. He was a veteran of multiple wars, an architect of American territorial expansion, and a proponent of naval modernization, particularly the transition to steam power. He was, in short, the perfect instrument for a mission that required a delicate balance of diplomacy and intimidation. The man and the moment were perfectly aligned. The instructions he received from U.S. President Millard Fillmore were a testament to the gravity of the expedition and the administration's realistic assessment of the challenge ahead. The orders were unambiguous: Perry was to pursue peaceful negotiations to establish diplomatic and trade relations. However, if the Japanese government proved unwilling to engage in dialogue and resisted American overtures, the president gave him a direct and unequivocal command to apply armed force. Commodore Old Bruin Perry sailed for Japan not merely as an envoy, but as the commander of a powerful military force, vested with the full authority to wage war if necessary to achieve his nation's objectives. The scale of the American endeavor was made manifest on November 24, 1852, when a 10-vessel squadron embarked on its long journey into the unknown. This was not a tentative diplomatic probe but a fully fledged naval expedition, designed to project power and endure the rigors of a voyage that would span half the globe. The fleet was a deliberate mix of the old and the new, a floating testament to the technological transition reshaping naval power. At its heart were the formidable steam frigates Mississippi-, Susquehanna-, and Powhatan-, the very embodiment of the industrial might that Commodore Perry intended to display. These were supported by a complement of traditional sailing vessels, including the storeship, Supply, and the sloops of war, Plymouth, Saratoga, Macedonian, Vandalia, Lexington, and Southampton. This combined force represented a significant commitment of U.S. naval resources, signaling to the world, and most importantly to the Japanese, the seriousness of American intent. The route chosen for the expedition was a monumental undertaking, tracing a path of global naval power from the Atlantic seaboard deep into Asian waters. After departing Norfolk, the squadron crossed the Atlantic, making its first stop at the island of Madeira on December 11, 1852. From there, the ships continued south, navigating the vast ocean to call at the remote British outpost of St. Helena before rounding the Cape of Good Hope. They reached Cape Town on January 24, 1853, pausing to resupply before venturing into the Indian Ocean. The long eastward voyage continued with stops at Mauritius and then Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, from March 10 to the 15th. Each port of call was a critical logistical link in a chain stretching thousands of miles, allowing the fleet to take on provisions, make repairs, and gather intelligence. The squadron arrived in the strategic choke point of Singapore on March 29, before proceeding to the Portuguese colony of Macau on April 7. The final legs of the journey saw the ships reach the British hub of Hong Kong on April 29 and the bustling treaty port of Shanghai on May 4, placing them on the very doorstep of their ultimate destination. This was no journey left to chance, it was a masterclass in strategic planning and logistical foresight. The expedition's planners had undertaken a task of immense importance, recognizing that the success of the steam-powered frigates depended entirely on a consistent supply of fuel. A detailed map of the entire voyage had been compiled, with a critical focus on a resource that was the lifeblood of this new naval age, coal. This map meticulously noted the locations of known coal deposits, with a particular emphasis on those identified on Taiwan. This forethought ensured that Perry's black ships would not be left powerless in hostile waters, granting him the operational freedom and endurance needed to sustain a prolonged presence off the coast of Japan. This level of preparation stood in stark contrast to previous, less successful American overtures. Indeed, Perry's mission was freighted with the weight of past failures. The United States had been attempting to establish formal relations with Japan for over half a century, only to be repeatedly and firmly rebuffed. This 1852 expedition was, in fact, the fourth significant American attempt to breach Japan's determined isolation. A series of intermittent efforts between 1797 and 1809 had come to nothing. A more direct attempt in 1837, involving the merchant ship Morrison - was met with cannon fire. Further official missions in 1846 and 1849 were also diplomatically stonewalled, with American commanders being treated with disdain and ordered to leave immediately. These repeated humiliations had fostered a consensus within the U.S. government that a different approach was required. The policy of polite requests had proven utterly ineffective against the shogunate's rigid adherence to its exclusionary laws. The strategic shift from hopeful diplomacy to coercive demonstration was not without precedent. It was directly informed by the hard-won experience of those who had tried and failed before. Captain James Glynn, who had led the 1849 mission to secure the release of shipwrecked American sailors, had returned to the United States with a stark warning for his government. His interaction with Japanese officials in Nagasaki convinced him that polite diplomacy was perceived as weakness. The Japanese, he insisted, were a nation that respected power and ceremony above all else. They would only yield, he argued, to a clear and undeniable demonstration of military might. This crucial piece of intelligence directly shaped the formation and character of Perry's expedition. The 10 warships, the advanced weaponry, and the choice of a stern commander like Old Bruin were all calculated elements of a strategy designed to heed Glynn's warning and ensure that this fourth attempt would not end in failure. After months of traversing the world's great oceans, the American squadron finally reached the outer sphere of Japanese influence. On May 26, 1853, the imposing black hulls of Perry's warships dropped anchor in the waters of Naha, the capital city of the Ryukyu Kingdom on the island of Okinawa. This was the first active phase of the expedition, a calculated dress rehearsal for the main event in Edo Bay. The arrival of the powerful fleet was an immediate and profound shock to the tranquil island kingdom. The initial diplomatic exchange set a tone of confrontation that would define the entire mission. When Commodore Perry formally requested an audience, the government of King Shotai politely but firmly refused, citing long-standing traditions and inflexible court rules that forbade such a meeting. For the Ryukyuan authorities, adherence to protocol was paramount. For Commodore Perry, a man on a mission from his president, such obstacles were merely trifles to be swept aside. He was not, as his reputation suggested, a man inclined to compromise. Faced with this diplomatic impasse, Perry immediately escalated the situation, demonstrating the core principle of his strategy: when diplomacy fails, display force. He ordered a landing party ashore, not of diplomats, but of a fully armed contingent of U.S. Marines. Their stated purpose was to provide security, but their presence was an unambiguous show of military capability. Under the watchful eyes of these armed guards, and without the courtesy of an invitation, Perry and his retinue began a determined march toward the royal seat of power, Shuri Castle. The Ryukyuan government was thrown into a crisis. The kingdom possessed no significant military force capable of offering any meaningful resistance to the well-drilled and heavily armed Americans. King Shotai found himself in an impossible position. To continue to refuse would risk open conflict and the potential destruction of his capital. To acquiesce would be a violation of his nation's laws and a deep personal humiliation. Understanding the stark reality of the power imbalance, the king was compelled to yield, and the palace gates were reluctantly opened to the uninvited American Commodore. Once inside the castle, Perry formally presented the message from the President of the United States, which outlined the American demand for the establishment of diplomatic and trade relations. King Shotai, though forced to receive the Commodore, proved to be a shrewd political operator. He could not openly defy the Americans, but he could deflect. He informed Perry that the Ryukyu kingdom, while possessing its own monarch, was not a fully sovereign state. Ultimate authority, he explained, rested with his suzerain in Edo. Therefore, he lacked the power to agree to such a treaty. From the Ryukyuan perspective, the crisis had been navigated with the least possible damage. Their capital had been spared a violent pogrom, and the immense responsibility of dealing with the formidable foreigners had been successfully passed up the chain of command to the Japanese shogunate. With a temporary base of operations established, Perry used the following weeks to further his strategic objectives. On June 9, 1853, leaving a portion of his squadron to maintain presence in Naha, he sailed to the Ogasawara, Bonin Islands, a remote archipelago to the east. In a bold expansionist move, he proclaimed the islands to be a territory of the United States, a claim that would later be contested by both Great Britain and Russia. He also employed softer diplomatic tactics. On June 26, Perry invited several Ryukyuan officials to a grand banquet aboard his flagship, the USS Susquehanna. There, in the shadow of the ship's powerful cannons, he treated his guests to a lavish meal of French cuisine, a cultural display intended to impress upon them the sophistication and wealth of the Western world. The American presence in Naha lasted for a total of 43 days, from May 26 to July 24. This extended stay was far from idle. It was a period of intense and methodical intelligence gathering. The expedition meticulously surveyed the archipelago, assessing its economic resources and commercial potential. This was not a task left solely to officers and scientists. In a little-known aspect of the mission, the U.S. Marines played a crucial role beyond simple guard duty. They conducted extensive reconnaissance across the island, procured necessary equipment and supplies for the fleet, and actively scouted locations for potential future American facilities. The first landing in Okinawa was, therefore, much more than a simple diplomatic stopover. It was the strategic seizure of a forward base, a place to test tactics, and a thorough reconnaissance mission that provided Perry with invaluable knowledge before he steered his black ships toward the heart of Japan itself. The dress rehearsal in Ryukyu was over. On July 8, 1853, the true purpose of the American expedition was made terrifyingly clear as four of Commodore Perry's warships steamed defiantly into the Uraga Strait, the strategic mouth of the bay leading directly to the shogun's capital, Edo. This select squadron, consisting of the steam frigates Mississippi and Susquehanna, and the sloops of war, Plymouth and Saratoga, was a calculated display of overwhelming force. The vessels bristled with approximately 100 of the most advanced naval cannons of the era, Paixhan's guns, capable of firing devastating explosive shells that could reduce traditional wooden fortifications to splinters. Aboard these ships were 2,000 well-armed American sailors, a force larger than many daimyo armies. Their entry into the bay, a waterway explicitly forbidden to foreign vessels for over 2 centuries, was in itself an act of profound aggression. The American squadron did not wait for a diplomatic reception. Immediately upon arrival, the ships were maneuvered into combat-ready positions, their guns aimed toward the shore. In a blatant violation of Japanese sovereignty, Perry ordered his men to begin taking depth soundings of the bay, an action akin to a military survey of home territory. To announce their presence and underscore their military capability, the ships then fired a series of signal salutes from their massive cannons. Though these were blank rounds, the thunderous reports echoing across the water sent a shockwave of terror through the capital. Panic initially gripped Edo. The sight of the monstrous, smoke-belching, black ships and the sound of their cannons created a scene of chaos. However, as it became clear that the ships were not commencing an all-out bombardment, the fear of the residents began to transform into a profound and irresistible curiosity. Thousands of people, from commoners to samurai, flocked to the shoreline, lining the coast for a chance to witness the incredible foreign vessels that had materialized in their sacred waters. The impression these ships made on the Japanese psyche was immediate and deep. One eyewitness, struggling to comprehend the scale and technology before him, recorded that it was as if watching a castle floating on the sea, marveling at the strange, churning paddle wheels and the rows of enormous cannons that lined the decks. The initial fear, however, was very real. A Buddhist monk chronicled the terror in his diary, noting the practical effects of the American arrival on the common people. Fearing that negotiations would break down and a war would begin, he wrote, the villagers evacuated their household goods far away from the sea. The official response from the shogunate was hesitant. They first dispatched a low-ranking official, Nakajima Saburosuke, to board the American flagship and demand their departure. Commodore Perry, however, was engaged in a calculated performance of power and prestige. He flatly refused to speak with an official of such insignificant rank, insisting that he carried a message from the President of the United States and would only deliver it to a representative of the highest authority. When the Japanese sent a slightly more senior official, Kayama Izuman, Perry once again rebuffed him. The Commodore's posture was unyielding. He escalated his demands, stating that if the shogunate did not provide a suitably high-ranking personage to receive the presidential letter, he would land his marines, march on Edo itself and deliver the message to the shogun in person. This direct threat of an invasion of the capital city placed the Japanese government in an untenable position. The head of the ruling council, Abe Masahiro, recognized the gravity of the situation. Faced with the choice between a humiliating diplomatic concession and a potentially catastrophic war against a technologically superior foe, he took personal responsibility and made the historic decision to accept the American letter. A formal reception was hastily arranged to take place on the beach at Kurihama on July 14. Perry, a master of military theater, orchestrated his landing for maximum psychological impact. He came ashore with a grand procession of 200 sailors and marines dressed in their finest parade uniforms, marching to the stirring sounds of the naval band playing "Hail, Columbia." In a carefully constructed ceremony, Perry formally presented the president's letter, which contained proposals for a trade treaty, to the shogun's designated representatives. To ensure it was understood, the document was provided in 3 languages, English, Dutch, and Chinese. In response, the Japanese officials, led by Abe Masahiro's delegates, informed Perry that the shogun, Tokugawa Yayoshi, was gravely ill and thus unable to respond immediately. An answer to the American proposal, they insisted, could only be given in the following year. Having delivered his ultimatum and made his undeniable show of force, Perry accepted this temporary delay. On July 17, just over a week after their shocking arrival, the 4 black ships weighed anchor and steamed out of Edo Bay, leaving a stunned and divided Japan to contemplate its future. Commodore Perry's departure from Edo Bay did not bring a return to normalcy. Instead, it plunged the Tokugawa shogunate into a political crisis of unprecedented proportions, a turmoil that was profoundly deepened by a sudden turn of fate. Just 10 days after the American squadron vanished over the horizon, on July 27, 1853, the 12th shogun, Tokugawa Yayoshi, died. The timing could not have been worse. The nation was left without a strong, decisive leader at the very moment it faced its greatest external threat in centuries. The burden of leadership passed to his son, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man known to be sickly and ill-suited to navigate the treacherous political waters that lay ahead. The shogunate was suddenly adrift, its chain of command broken, leaving the responsibility for Japan's future resting squarely on the shoulders of the head of the council, Abe Masahiro. Haunted by the gravity of the American ultimatum and fearful of taking personal responsibility for a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of Japanese history, Abe Masahiro took a radical and historic step. In a stunning departure from 2 centuries of absolute Tokugawa rule, he broke the shogunate's long-held monopoly on national policy-making. He convened an all-Japan assembly, Sandaitu, a grand council that brought together key figures from across the nation's complex power structure. For the first time, representatives of the emperor, officials from the shogunate's own bureaucracy, powerful regional lords, daimyo, and members of the court nobility were all summoned to debate a single, critical question: should Japan acquiesce to Perry's demands and open the country, or should it refuse and risk war? This act, intended to build consensus and share the burden of responsibility, instead exposed the deep and bitter divisions fracturing the ruling class. The assembly quickly devolved into a forum for intractable debate, revealing a nation fundamentally at odds with itself. On one side were the pragmatists and shogunate officials who had witnessed the American military power firsthand. They understood the technological gulf between Japan and the West and counseled that signing a treaty, however humiliating, was the only realistic path to avoid a disastrous conflict. On the other side were the hardliners, swept up in a tide of xenophobic sentiment and fierce martial pride. They vehemently argued for the preservation of Sakoku-, the sacred policy of isolation, insisting that Japan must resist the foreign barbarians at all costs. The debate raged, but no unified decision could be reached. The assembly, meant to create a single national policy, only succeeded in paralyzing the government. Japan was left in a state of profound uncertainty, caught between the threat of foreign invasion and the risk of internal collapse. While the Japanese leadership was locked in this internal struggle, news of the shogun's death traveled across the sea. Commodore Perry, then in Hong Kong, received the intelligence and immediately recognized the strategic opportunity it presented. The Japanese had asked for a year to consider their response, citing the shogun's illness. His subsequent death provided them with a legitimate reason for further delay. Perry, however, was determined not to let the political chaos in Edo work against his mission. He concluded that the shogunate was stalling and that the internal power vacuum could be exploited. Rather than honoring the requested year-long waiting period, he made the decisive choice to accelerate his timeline and return to Japan much sooner than expected, intending to capitalize on the government's disarray and force a resolution. This period of intense political turmoil also gave rise to acts of individual desperation, highlighting the anxiety gripping the nation. While the great lords and officials debated in their castles, others felt compelled to seek knowledge directly from the source. In a little-known but significant episode, a young, forward-thinking samurai named Yoshida Shoin, frustrated with the government's indecisiveness, attempted to make clandestine contact with the Americans. Impatient with the official channels and eager to understand the West, he tried to secretly board one of the foreign ships, an act that was strictly forbidden and punishable by death. His failed attempt was a symbol of a growing realization among some Japanese that the world was changing and that knowledge of the outsiders, rather than blind resistance, was the key to survival. The shogunate was paralyzed by indecision, but the seeds of a new way of thinking were already beginning to sprout in the shadows. True to his word but far ahead of the agreed-upon schedule, Commodore Perry returned to the waters of Japan, this time with an even greater and more intimidating force. On February 11, 1854, the sloop, Southampton, appeared as a harbinger off the coast of the Uraga Strait. It was soon followed by the rest of the squadron, an armada that had grown significantly since its first appearance. Where there had been 4 ships the previous summer, there were now 9 to 10, a deliberate and overwhelming display of American resolve. Perry was not returning to ask for an answer, he was returning to demand one. Dispensing with any pretense of polite diplomacy, the squadron did not linger at the mouth of the bay but advanced purposefully, arranging itself in a formidable battle line that posed a direct and undeniable threat to the capital city of Edo. The effect on the populace was immediate and terrifying. The shock of the black ships' return, amplified by their sheer numbers and aggressive posture, sent a fresh wave of panic through the city. One Buddhist monk, chronicling the events in his diary, captured the profound impression of dread that gripped the residents as they gazed upon the menacing fleet. The shogunate was caught completely off guard. Unpleasantly surprised by Perry's early arrival and still paralyzed by the internal divisions that had festered since the shogun's death, the government had no unified plan of action. Confronted with a naval force that could likely incinerate their capital, they had little choice but to concede. They quickly abandoned any pretense of resistance and granted the Americans permission to come ashore, directing them to the small coastal village of Yokohama. In an attempt to manage the situation with a display of traditional Japanese hospitality, the head of the council, Abe Masahiro, organized a grand and costly banquet for the American delegation, an affair reported to have cost an astonishing 2,000 gold pieces. The gesture, however, failed to bridge the vast cultural divide. The Japanese cuisine, with its subtle flavors and emphasis on seafood and vegetables, did not appeal to the American palate. The sailors and officers found it wanting, specifically complaining about the lack of meat and fats. The Japanese, in turn, were fascinated by the foreigners' customs. One Japanese observer meticulously recorded his impressions, noting that the Americans cut their food with a knife and ate with something resembling small rakes, their first encounter with the fork. He also noted their particular fondness for the sweet sake known as mirindash. Formal negotiations finally commenced on March 8 in a specially constructed hall in Yokohama. Yet, the most potent tool of American diplomacy would prove to be not a document, but a demonstration. On March 21, Perry unveiled his trump card, a fully operational, quarter-scale model of a steam locomotive, complete with a carriage, a tender, and a circular track nearly 100 meters long. On the shores of Yokohama, a technological miracle unfolded. As the black steam train hissed to life and sped around its track, it caused a sensation of utter astonishment and delight among the Japanese officials. The carriage itself was so small that it could barely accommodate a 6-year-old child, but this did not deter the assembled dignitaries. In a moment of pure, unadulterated wonder, high-ranking shogunate officials, forgetting all notions of samurai dignity and stoicism, climbed onto the roof of the tiny car, their loose robes flapping in the wind as they were carried along. Their joyous laughter echoed across the grounds. Perry himself noted in his records that the normally reserved officials smiled so broadly that their teeth were visible, finding the sight of their countrymen riding the marvelous machine irresistibly amusing. Following this powerful display of industrial might, Perry invited the Japanese commissioners to a reciprocal banquet aboard his flagship, the Powhatan Dash, on March 27. Finally, with American technological and military superiority firmly established, the treaty was signed. On March 31, 1854, in the village of Yokohama, Ambassador Hayashi Fukusai, presiding for the shogunate, put his seal to the 12-article Convention of Kanagawa, formerly known as the Treaty of Peace and Amity. The agreement opened a new chapter in Japanese history, its key provisions stipulating the supplying of American ships with fuel and provisions, the rescue and safe treatment of shipwrecked American sailors, the opening of the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American trade, and the granting of most favored nation status to the United States in all commercial dealings. The gates of Japan, sealed for over 2 centuries, had finally been pried open. While Commodore Perry's gunboat diplomacy unfolded in official, high-stakes encounters, a parallel and equally significant event was taking place on the streets of Edo, an unprecedented explosion of public information. The primary vehicle for this phenomenon was the Kawaraban Dash, cheap, woodblock printed news leaflets that served as the mass media of the era. Between 1853 and 1854, dozens of different Kawaraban dedicated entirely to the subject of the black ships were published throughout the capital. Each of these leaflets was produced in a print run of approximately 1,000 copies, a staggering volume of information dissemination for such a concentrated period, marking a record for the entire Edo era. For the first time, a major national crisis was being documented and explained to the common people in near real time. The initial wave of these publications catered directly to the public's immediate fears and the pressing need for intelligence on the foreign threat. The first, Kawaraban, focused on the raw, intimidating facts of the American squadron. They provided details on the immense size of the ships, listed the number of powerful cannons mounted on their decks, and even circulated diagrams purporting to show the shogunate's defensive alignments for Tokyo Bay. This was practical, urgent information that allowed the residents of Edo to grasp the scale of the military force that had appeared in their waters. However, as the situation evolved from armed standoff to cautious negotiation, the content of the Kawaraban shifted dramatically. The focus moved from military specifications to the diplomatic and cultural dimensions of the encounter. The leaflets began to report on the progress of the negotiations, giving the public a sense of the discussions happening behind closed doors. They became fascinated with the details of the cultural exchange, publishing the menus of the banquets held for the Americans with specific references to dishes like abalone, roe from the matsu fish, and boiled tofu. The lavish gifts presented by Perry were also described in detail, as were the Japanese return offerings, such as a grand sumo wrestling tournament arranged as a form of official entertainment. This particular event highlights the cultural gulf that Kawaraban could not always bridge. While the Japanese presented their greatest national sport, Perry's own records dryly noted that the powerful wrestlers were too fleshy and looked like lumps of fat, suggesting the spectacle was not the resounding success the hosts had intended. Crucially, the Kawaraban went beyond simply reporting on the events in the Bay. They began to serve as the first primers for the Japanese public on the United States itself. Through these simple news sheets, the people of Edo learned fundamental facts about this powerful new nation, that it had declared its independence from Great Britain in 1776, and that its capital was a distant city named Washington. In this way, the leaflets helped to demystify the foreigners, replacing monstrous caricatures with concrete, if basic, information. By chronicling everything from cannon counts to diplomatic dinners, the Kawaraban played an indispensable role in helping the citizens of Edo process the shock of Perry's arrival, guiding their perceptions from raw panic toward a more informed, and deeply felt, curiosity about the United States and its formidable fleet. The diplomatic negotiations were underpinned by a carefully orchestrated display of Western technological supremacy, a message conveyed not only through the cannons of the black ships but also through the remarkable gifts Commodore Perry presented to the Japanese leadership. The technological chasm between the two nations was starkly illustrated by the very vessels of the American squadron. The flagship, the USS Powhatan Dash, was a steam-powered behemoth with a displacement of 2,415 tons. This single vessel was more than 10 times larger than the biggest Japanese ships of the period, which typically displaced around 200 tons. To the local fishermen and sailors of Tokyo Bay, who were able to witness the fleet up close, the American warships were a source of profound amazement, their strange and massive outlines unlike anything they had ever imagined. These were not gifts in the traditional sense of diplomatic pleasantries, they were a curated exhibition of American industrial and cultural power, intended to both dazzle and intimidate. Perry bestowed these items upon the highest echelons of the Japanese power structure, the shogun himself, the powerful regional daimyo dash, and the high-ranking vassals known as hatamoto dash. The Japanese, in turn, recognized the significance of these foreign objects, meticulously documenting them for posterity on beautifully rendered pictorial scrolls. The collection was a veritable catalogue of Western modernity, a collection of wonders designed to showcase a world far beyond Japan's shores. It included sophisticated musical instruments, modern firearms and other weapons, advanced agricultural tools designed for efficiency, and the near-magical telegraph apparatus that could send messages instantaneously over wires. The offerings also included items of luxury and comfort, such as exotic perfumes, various types of alcohol, and finely crafted furniture. The undisputed centerpiece of this collection, however, was a gift that perfectly encapsulated the power and promise of the Industrial Revolution, a fully functional, quarter-scale model of a steam locomotive, complete with a passenger carriage, a tender for its fuel, and a circular railway approximately 100 meters in length. This miniature railroad was not a static display, it was a working demonstration of the technology that was transforming the West. The sight of this self-propelled machine moving with speed and power left the Japanese officials in a state of utter fascination. It was a tangible symbol of a new age, and it had a profound impact on all who witnessed it. The reaction of the Japanese to these items was one of undeniable and openly expressed admiration. The gifts, brought ashore by the American sailors, were objects of intense curiosity and wonder. While the encounter was born of military threat, the allure of Western technology was irresistible. This moment of cultural and technological encounter is perfectly captured in an anecdote involving one of the shogunate's officials, Kawada Hashinosuke. Like his colleagues, he joyfully rode upon the miniature train, but his experience went beyond simple amusement. Deeply impressed by the technology, Kawada made detailed sketches of the locomotive and recorded his observations in his personal notes, preserving the information for future study. His actions were a microcosm of the larger Japanese response that would soon follow, a rapid transition from passive wonder to an active and urgent desire to understand, replicate, and ultimately master the very technologies that had been used to force their nation's hand. The gifts were, therefore, simultaneously symbols of a political defeat and catalysts for an intellectual awakening. The signing of the Convention of Kanagawa on March 31 was a monumental diplomatic achievement, but it was an agreement of broad principles, not a detailed rulebook. The essential, practical work of defining how this new and unprecedented relationship between the United States and Japan would function on a daily basis was yet to be done. To address this, the two delegations agreed to continue their discussions, moving from the ceremonial site at Yokohama to the more practical setting of one of the newly opened ports. The venue chosen was the Ryosenji Temple in Shimoda, a location that would now be at the very center of Japanese-American interaction. Within the serene grounds of the Buddhist monastery, negotiators for both sides engaged in the painstaking process of hammering out the fine print that would govern the American presence on Japanese soil. These focused and detailed talks culminated on June 15, 1854, with the signing of a comprehensive, 13-article protocol. This supplemental agreement, or addendum, was designed to clarify and expand upon the general terms of the original treaty, providing concrete regulations for potential points of friction and misunderstanding. The protocol addressed the critical logistical questions of access and territory. It precisely defined the specific locations within the harbors of Shimoda and Hakodate where American ships were permitted to moor. Furthermore, it established the physical boundaries within which Americans were allowed to live and, if tragedy struck, to be buried, carefully delineating the foreign footprint in these communities. The agreement also proactively sought to prevent cultural clashes by outlining specific rules of conduct, including an explicit prohibition on hunting by the American visitors. Finally, acknowledging that this was the beginning of a long-term engagement that would require constant dialogue, the protocol mandated the future presence of permanent interpreters, ensuring that a formal and reliable channel of communication would be established to manage the relationship going forward. With the historic Convention of Kanagawa signed and its detailed provisions codified in Shimoda, the primary objective of the American expedition was achieved. On June 25, 1854, having fundamentally and permanently altered the course of Japanese history, the United States squadron finally weighed anchor and began the long voyage home. The mission, however, was not entirely complete. Commodore Perry had one final piece of diplomatic business to conclude, a strategic bookend to a campaign that had begun in the very same waters just over a year earlier. The fleet set a course back to the Ryukyu Islands, the vital stepping stone that had served as his initial base of operations and the first test of his coercive diplomatic strategy. The return to Naha was not merely a courtesy call. Perry intended to formalize the relationship between the United States and the small island kingdom, securing American privileges there with the same binding force he had applied to the shogunate. On July 11, 1854, he concluded this final act, signing a 7-article compact between the United States and the Ryukyu Kingdom, a formal treaty of peace and friendship. While styled as a mutual agreement, its terms overwhelmingly reflected American interests and were a direct consequence of the overwhelming military power Perry had at his disposal. This compact effectively transformed Ryukyu into a permanent and official logistical hub for the United States in East Asia. The provisions of the treaty were clear, concise, and profoundly consequential for the small kingdom. First, it formally declared a regime of free trade in Ryukyu, opening the nation's ports to American commerce without the restrictions and protocols that had governed its limited trade for centuries. Second, the agreement stipulated that the Ryukyuan government was obligated to provide American ships with provisions and fuel. Critically, this was to be done at the expense of the Ryukyu Kingdom, placing a significant economic and logistical burden on the host nation. Third, the treaty codified maritime rescue norms, requiring the Ryukyuans to provide assistance and protection to any American vessel that found itself in distress or shipwrecked in their waters. The most significant and far-reaching provision, however, was the final one. The treaty granted the United States the right to establish American settlements in Ryukyu. This was a monumental concession of sovereignty, allowing for a permanent American physical presence on the islands. It effectively guaranteed the United States a strategic foothold, a reliable coaling station, and a safe harbor for its naval and commercial fleets operating on the lucrative trade routes to China. With this treaty, Perry fulfilled one of the core strategic objectives that had motivated the expedition from its very inception. He had not only opened Japan but had also secured a vital link in the chain of American maritime power stretching across the Pacific. The Ryukyu Compact was the final, crucial piece in the new geopolitical architecture he had been sent to construct. The arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships was a profound psychological shock that sent tremors through every level of Japanese society, initiating a rapid and dramatic transformation in the national mindset. The initial and most visceral reaction was one of pure terror. The sight of the massive, smoke-belching warships and the sound of their powerful cannons were unlike anything the Japanese had ever experienced. This deep-seated fear was not merely an abstract anxiety, it had tangible consequences for the common people. A Buddhist monk, chronicling the events in his diary, captured the panic that seized the coastal communities, writing that the inhabitants, fearing imminent war, evacuated their household goods farther away from the sea. This flight from the coast was a testament to the genuine belief that the foreign vessels brought with them the promise of death and destruction. However, as the days and weeks of negotiation unfolded and it became increasingly clear that the Americans were not going to initiate an immediate, all-out war, this paralyzing fear began to recede. The structured, if tense, interactions between the shogunate and Perry's delegation suggested a path forward that did not lead to immediate conflict. As the threat of violence diminished, fear was gradually supplanted by a powerful and deeply human emotion, curiosity. By the time of the second visit in the spring of 1854, the atmosphere had changed markedly. The residents of Yokohama, who now found themselves at the epicenter of this historic encounter, were overcome by a desire to see and understand the strange foreigners. They began to cautiously interact with the American crew, their initial terror replaced by an insatiable inquisitiveness. This remarkable shift in sentiment was perfectly captured by the same monk who had earlier documented their fear. By the time the fleet was preparing to depart, he noted a complete reversal in the villagers' attitudes, writing that they were even sorry to say goodbye to the crew. This period of interaction also brought a series of jarring cultural encounters that challenged the very foundations of the Japanese worldview. Luo Sen, a Chinese scholar serving as an interpreter for the American fleet, documented some of these strange meetings in his Japanese diaries. In one telling episode, a vassal of the shogun was not only surprised but deeply offended to learn that a highly educated man from China, the revered center of civilization in the traditional East Asian order, had hired himself out to work for the barbaric Americans. This single interaction revealed the profound shock to the established hierarchy. It was incomprehensible that the civilized center could be in the employ of the uncivilized periphery. Furthermore, the Japanese witnessed for the first time black members of the American crew, whom they observed being assigned particularly dangerous tasks, adding another layer of complexity to their dawning understanding of the outside world's social and racial structures. Ultimately, the arrival of Perry's fleet did more than just open ports, it shattered a worldview that had been carefully maintained for over 2 centuries. The undeniable technological and military superiority of the Americans forced Japanese society to confront a new and unsettling reality. The Western nations were systematically extending their influence across Asia, and the world was now dominated by white people. This realization was a pivotal moment, completely reorienting Japan's understanding of its place in the global order. It was this profound psychological shift that laid the essential groundwork for the Meiji Restoration, 1868 to 1912. The controlled opening of the country, managed without a devastating war, convinced the Japanese elite that the only path to survival was not blind resistance but rapid modernization. This acceptance of a new reality allowed Japan to embark on its transformative reforms with a degree of national consensus and a lack of major internal resistance that would have otherwise been unthinkable. Indeed, had the crisis not been resolved in such a controlled, peaceful manner, it is likely that the nation would have collapsed into bloody civil wars, fueled by the reactionary slogan of Sano Joy - Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians. Perry's expedition, therefore, did not just bring ships, it brought a new way of seeing the world that would change Japan forever. Commodore Perry's success did not occur in a vacuum, it served as a blueprint and an open invitation for other Western powers, who were quick to capitalize on the breach he had made in Japan's wall of isolation. The Convention of Kanagawa was not an isolated event but the first link in a chain of what would come to be known as the unequal treaties. Immediately following the American breakthrough, other nations pressed their own demands upon the weakened shogunate. Great Britain secured a similar treaty in 1854, followed swiftly by Russia in 1855. France compelled Japan to sign its own agreement in 1858. The United States itself was not content to rest on its initial success. On July 29, 1858, the Harris Treaty was signed, a far more comprehensive commercial agreement that established more advantageous and detailed terms for the U.S., further eroding Japanese sovereignty. The gates, once forced ajar, had been thrown wide open. This sudden and overwhelming influx of foreign influence plunged Japan into a prolonged period of profound internal turmoil and civil unrest. The shogunate's authority, already damaged by its inability to defy Perry, was shattered. The government's capitulation to the foreign powers unleashed a torrent of anti-government and xenophobic sentiment that destabilized the entire nation. The crisis was compounded by a failure of leadership at the highest level. Shortly after these events, the last shogun of the Tokugawa clan died, creating a critical power vacuum at a time when the country desperately needed strong, centralized leadership. This convergence of foreign pressure and domestic instability proved to be a volatile and deadly combination. From the chaos, a powerful and violent reactionary movement emerged, rallying around the potent and evocative slogan, Sano Joy - Revere the Emperor, Expel the Barbarians. This movement channeled the widespread anger and humiliation into a campaign of terror directed at the foreign presence. Adherents to this ideology began a brutal hunt for Europeans and Americans on Japanese soil, leading to a series of assassinations and violent attacks that created a climate of constant fear. The period was marked by deep internal divisions and bloodshed, as the nation teetered on the brink of all-out civil war. Japan was only pulled back from the abyss by a fundamental and revolutionary shift in its political structure. The long and violent internal crisis finally culminated in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. This event swept away the crumbling power of the Tokugawa shogunate and restored direct imperial rule, ushering in a new era of radical transformation. It was only after this restoration that Japan was able to regain its footing. The new Meiji government, recognizing that the barbarians could not be expelled by force of will alone, made a pragmatic and strategic pivot. Instead of feudal resistance, Japan embarked on a national project of rapid modernization, actively seeking to learn from and adopt the technologies of the colonial powers. This was not done out of admiration, but as a calculated strategy for self-preservation, ensuring that Japan itself would never fall victim to the same forces it had been forced to bow to. Commodore Perry returned to the United States in 1855, the successful executor of one of the most significant diplomatic missions in the nation's history. His achievement was formally and generously recognized by the American government. A grateful U.S. Congress awarded him a prize of $20,000, a substantial sum at the time, for his masterful and successful opening of Japan. Furthermore, Congress gave a directive to immortalize the journey, commissioning the publication of the official expedition report. This comprehensive, multi-volume work, titled Narrative of the Expedition of an American Squadron to the China Seas and Japan, in the years 1852, 1853, and 1854, under the command of Commodore M.C. Perry, was printed in 1856. Co-authored with the historian Francis L. Hawkes, this chronicle, filled with detailed observations, scientific data, and cultural insights, became the definitive American text on the subject. For many years, it stood as the only major, capital study of Japan available to the American public, shaping an entire generation's understanding of the once reclusive nation. Despite the official honors and the success of his mission, the long and arduous years at sea had taken a severe toll on Perry's health. The decades of service, culminating in the immense strain of the Japan expedition, had left him physically depleted, and he was soon forced to retire from active naval duty. In recognition of his singular accomplishments in East Asia, he was granted a final promotion to the rank of Rear Admiral. His retirement, however, was to be tragically short. On March 4, 1858, at the age of 64, Matthew Calbraith Perry died in New York City. The official cause of death was recorded as cirrhosis of the liver, a condition brought on by the excessive consumption of alcohol. On March 21, 1866, his remains were moved from New York and reinterred in his family's home city of Newport, Rhode Island, bringing the "Father of the Steam Navy" to his final resting place. The story of Commodore Perry, however, concludes with a moment of profound and almost unbelievable historical irony, a scene that perfectly bookends the era of American-Japanese relations he initiated. Nearly a century after his death, on September 2, 1945, Imperial Japan formally surrendered to the Allied powers, ending the Second World War. The official ceremony of capitulation took place on the deck of the American battleship USS Missouri, a vessel of the same powerful class as Perry's own steam frigates. In a gesture laden with symbolism, the ceremony was conducted before a historic American flag that had been carefully preserved. It was the very same flag that Commodore Perry had flown from his flagship when he first sailed into Edo Bay. The final, personal connection bridging the centuries was the man presiding over the surrender as the head of the American delegation. It was General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, a distant relative of the same Commodore who had forced Japan open 91 years earlier. The legacy of Commodore Matthew Perry is as complex and impactful as the mission he undertook. In the grand narrative of American history, his role has been firmly and traditionally established. He is venerated as the great discoverer of Japan, the man who single-handedly brought a reclusive feudal nation into the fold of the modern Western world. This portrayal casts him as a pivotal figure in 19th-century American expansion, a symbol of the nation's manifest destiny projected across the Pacific. This legacy is not merely an abstract concept, it is preserved and honored through tangible artifacts and memorials that keep the memory of his expedition alive. The most potent of these symbols is the very flag that flew from his flagship, the banner under which he sailed into Edo Bay. This historic artifact is carefully preserved and displayed at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where it serves as an inspiration for future generations of naval officers and a direct link to a defining moment in the history of the U.S. Navy. His memory is further cemented in the physical landscape of both the nation he served and the one he forced open. Museums and monuments have been erected in his honor in his home state of Rhode Island, celebrating him as a native son who changed the course of world history. Across the Pacific, in the Japanese city of Yokosuka, the very place where he first stepped ashore, monuments also stand, a testament to the profound and enduring impact his arrival had on the Japanese nation itself. Perry's formidable persona has also found its way into popular culture, ensuring his story is told beyond the pages of history books. In the 1981 film, The Sword of Bushido, the role of the stern and imposing Commodore was portrayed by the American actor Richard Boone, bringing a cinematic dimension to the historical figure. Perhaps most significantly, the legacy of the Perry expedition has been wielded as a powerful political symbol. At the conclusion of the Second World War, as the United States stood victorious over Japan, American politicians deliberately invoked the memory of his first landing. His expedition was framed as the beginning of an era of American power and influence in the region, and the 1945 victory was presented as a symbolic and forceful return of that power, bringing the historical narrative full circle.